Alright, so this is my final summary on the conservation in the Philippines. We're going to cover most of the topics that we covered in class with a little bit of new material as well. My dogs are in the room, so sorry if you hear any noises. So let's recap. The Philippines is a country composed of over 7,000 islands. And then interdisciplinary work is important in the Philippines because here, unlike some places, the people are actually very, very reliant on their surrounding environments. Um, Many of these studies help conservation by relaying different perspectives and sciences. So marine and terrestrial biology are extremely important due to the proximity of space that they share with their wildlife. Geology and geography is important as well, along with environmental and civil engineering. Climate studies and then cultural studies are also very helpful. It's really good to have different perspectives just because it can help you gain different viewpoints on conservation as a whole, as well as helping the public to understand it as well. So the Philippines has both genetic and organismal diversity. There's over 52,000 species that have been described on these islands, many of which live on each island as its own, as endemic species, and many of them spread over the islands as well. And then some of them are closely related to species on neighboring islands all the way to Australia. So cockatoos are my favorite example of this. All of these species are related. They're just endemic to different areas, so some of them stretch to New Guinea, all the way to the cockatiel, which goes to Australia. So all these different species are related but can be found throughout these areas. So that's just a really good example of how island regions can have such high biodiversity. We'll also be talking about island biogeography as well. So genetic diversity occurs within each region. It's a variation in the genetics of the species. When a species develops a subspecies, like cousins, this is genetically diverse. And then this method is helpful for survival and evolution. So when the conditions change and a certain individual from that species survives and reproduces, it can help spread its genetics around a little bit and help them survive and evolve. And this is especially helpful on different islands as well. So ecological diversity is the other one that we'll talk about. And it's common on island countries due to the separation and re-evolution of native species. So the Galapagos is a good example of that as well. We've all heard about the different endemic species there. But when a region contains enough resources, many species can adapt alongside each other as well. So that leads us into biodiversity. Biodiversity means there's more resources available. You would think that that isn't true because the species are kind of living so closely and there's so many different kinds of animals and plants, but that actually is a good thing because in an optimal environment, species compete for resources. And then therefore they become the best and most productive versions of themselves. This is one way that, plants became flowering plants. It's one way that insects became so good at what they do. And then, other plants, fruits, vegetables as well as coral reefs and whatnot. As you can see in this photo, there's a lot of different species living in such a small area. That's because there's must be a lot of nutrients in the water and then sunlight as well. So when there's enough resources, it can support more varieties of animals. So ecosystem services are one of the ideas that sprout out of biodiversity as a whole. So the processes that come from biodiversity, the growth and reproduction of plants and animals, are what give us these ecosystem services, which is basically something that an ecosystem gives us that we can use. Logging and forestry is a good example of this, but fishing and hunting is as well. And then, forests even filter water. They're great carbon sinks. And then they also help prevent erosion. Those are also services that they provide. And then that can stretch all the way to tourism and then spiritual significance as well. So anything that we can take from an ecosystem counts as a service. And ecosystems that are high in biodiversity generally have more of these services to provide. So one of the most significant threats to conservation in the Philippines is habitat loss. Now this is because there's such a small area of islands. Some of these islands are a mile by a mile, some of them are more like 25 miles. So they really vary in size, but no matter what, you still have humans living in close proximity to all this land and resources with an exponentially growing population. So that's the number one threat. And then drivers of this impact also include overexploitation of habitats, such as coral reefs, mangrove forests, and rainforests. Those are the three main ecosystems in the Philippines, and they're all extremely significant in one way or the other. Therefore, they're all being exploited a little too fast. Unsustainable methods of fishing, such as dynamite fishing and poison methods, have caused over a third of the damage to the surrounding reefs. The Philippines is actually the corner of a biodiversity hotspot that's lesser known as the Coral Triangle. And then that's a region of coral reefs and high biodiversity down in that area. But a lot of it's gone now because of overexploitation from surrounding industry fishing and local fishing as well. So habitat fragmentation is one of the things that occurs when areas of wildlife are isolated from one another. This creates islands of species, for lack of a better term. So this is a unfortunate product of habitat loss, and then also spread of people. So the more we build and settle, and the more roads we build, the more we're going to separate different fragments of habitat. A lot of animals are able to adapt to these conditions, but it does have a very negative impact on many other species as well. Fragmentation is responsible for many human-animal encounters, so it's not just the animals that suffer from this, it's people as well. And so a lot of times what happens is, people run into dangerous animals like snakes or alligators, and they'll kill them, and so it's really bad for both sides of the spectrum for there to be fragmented habitat like that. A lot of these encounters occur when animals are trying to cross over to another habitat for breeding purposes, or maybe they're just migrating or looking for new food and whatnot. So island biogeography is when a certain species are isolated and evolve in a specific area. One thing that I really like about this idea is that it doesn't just occur on islands, it's even in trenches and mountains. So, you'll see specific mountains, and one peak will have something evolved on it, and then the peak next to it will have a completely different species that's similar, because maybe they became separated at one point. This type of evolution is responsible for a lot of the dispersion of species during like continental drift and all those areas throughout history as well. And then this type of evolution is responsible for some of the famously extensive biodiversity in the island regions of the southern hemisphere. So as we know, most of the southern hemisphere is covered in water with a lot of islands in between. So the Galapagos Islands are a good example, the Philippines, the Hawaiian Islands. All those areas have very high biogeography, or very high biodiversity due to the island spread. Smaller populations are, however, especially sensitive to habitat loss and unusual weather patterns. I won't spoil the rest of this presentation. But yeah, so, they do really well in these small populations, small islands of land. However, when sudden changes occur, such as humans, they can have a hard time because they have such a small population. Both climate and human land use are responsible for species loss. Ecological meltdown can easily occur when keystone species are lost. So one example of this is the Philippine crocodile, Philippine alligator, sorry. It is a keystone species because it controls a lot of the surrounding prey species such as birds, fish, reptiles, frogs. But when these lizards are small, they're also a good food source for other animals. So when they are killed off or overhunted, or when they lose their ability to reproduce, moving from fragment to fragment, they can actually cause a large disruption to the rest of the ecosystem as well. The Philippines has since declared in 2012 over 240 areas totaling 35,000 square kilometers for conservation and species protection. This is a big deal considering they don't have a lot of land for themselves, let alone other species, so it really shows that they're trying to move forward with conservation. One of the things that they're doing as well is creating wildlife corridors. They're becoming more popular and supported in this region just because as the settlements connect to each other through road and railway and whatnot, a lot of times animals are forced to move across these boundaries, and then they're often killed in the process. And then conservation is especially important to the people of the Philippines. I know we talked about this in a previous presentation, but seafood makes up over half of their diet due to the fact that they're primarily coastal, of course. So almost 75% of their fishing ground have been over-harvested, unfortunately. This is due to industrial use as well as, or commercial fishing as well as local fishing. So the Philippines is also one of the biggest exporters of seafood. Therefore, conservation is not only important to feeding their own families, but it's also important to their economy as well. So some of the conservation efforts, they are at two levels. There's an area level and a species level. So at the species level, many projects, both local and international, are underway to promote conservation. The World Wildlife Fund is actually trying to spread a lot of awareness about conservation in the Philippines. But then they're also doing some more local efforts as well. So the government is actually teaching them how to use more sustainable fishing methods, and then also teaching them how to store them on the boat so they don't go bad. Because a lot of the fish that people catch, fish and seafood products, are actually wasted. I believe it's somewhere like 10 to 25%. And at area level, certain regions in the Philippines have important impacts for buffering typhoons. So mangrove forests are a great example of this. There's actually a lot of effort going into replanting these because not only do they provide protection from tsunamis and whatnot, but they're also really important breeding grounds for fish, crustaceans, and insects. It's a transition zone, so it's very important to the settlements on the Philippines, villages, and then it's important to the species as well. So another threat to conservation is the invasive species. This is a plant or animal that isn't native to an area, yet thrives enough to change the ecosystem, usually not in a good way. My favorite example of this is actually the Burmese pythons in Florida. They started out as escaped pets, escaped zoo animals, or released pets, and then they are wreaking havoc on the swamps down there. They're eating everything. There's a lot of really good examples of these in the Philippines as well. But since the Philippines is very coastal, a lot of the species are actually aquatic. So the big-headed carp is an invasive species in the Philippines. People hunt them for food, but they're actually not super great to eat, which is probably why they grew so fast in terms of space. Prevention methods include quarantines on plants and animals before they enter a country. There's also a lot of education that goes on about not releasing exotic pets. And then they also are trying to do a lot more studying before they consider releasing animals or plants into an environment, which sometimes is done for control purposes. Another good example of this is the mongoose and the habu snake on Okinawa. So the locals were having issues with the venomous viper snake that was biting farmers and killing them, so they released mongooses onto the islands, but they didn't think about what the mongoose would do to the rest of, the ecosystem, and they ended up causing way more harm than they were meant to. So another thing that we could think about is wildfires. They occur in the drier rural regions of the Philippines, usually by accident or farmers, cars as well. And since many are a result of human activity, it's pretty easy to prevent them, and there's a lot of education going on how to do that. But the dry season can cause them as well.